It was one of those warm afternoons that make time run slowly, as if the world outside were lulling itself with a soft lullaby. The sun was soft above, its gold rays stretching lazily over the green fields, and some sort of dreamy calmness was falling upon me. I sat with my sister on the bank of the river, observing the running water, whose murmurs whispered along while its dappled surface reflected the leaves above them. The air was heavy with the scent of summer, thick, warm, and sweet, wrapping me in its comforting blanket. My sister read a book, but it was one of those dull ones with no pictures, no conversations, just lines and lines of words that ran on and on. I remember thinking just how dull it all was, how my eyelids felt heavy in consequence, as if invisible strings attached to them were gently pulling them down. My mind wandered farther and farther afield, leaf on breeze style. What was the point of a book with no pictures or conversations? I thought, leaning backward into soft grass and letting thoughts swirl around indolently. And then, out of nowhere, a white rabbit with pink eyes ran by me. It was so sudden, so out of place, but somehow, at the same time, it felt so normal, like the most natural thing in the world to see this rabbit with pink eyes and a waistcoat and with a watch. Yes, a watch. I opened my eyes wider, more in curiosity than in startliness, as the rabbit muttered to itself, oh dear, I shall be late." I watched, fascinated, as he pulled out a pocket watch, his little paws quivering with urgency. Something inside me sparked curiosity, perhaps, and before I knew it, I was on my feet and running after the rabbit. The grass scraped along my ankles as I ran, my heart racing with the excitement of the hunt. The rabbit was speedy, but I just had time to see it disappear down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. I hesitated only for a moment before diving in. I fell, not quickly, but slowly, as if floating down through a dream. The walls of the tunnel were lined with curious objects, maps, pictures, and jars of marmalade that whispered secrets as I passed. Down, down, down I went, the world around me spinning with wonder. Finally, I landed softly on a bed of dry leaves in a dimly lit hall. The rabbit was there, hurrying down a long passage. I tried to follow, but all the doors opening into the hall were locked. Presently, a little gold key lay on a glass table. There was a small door behind the curtain. It fitted. Peeping through the doorway, I saw the most beautiful garden I'd ever laid eyes on. Flowers were colored and bright, the air fresh with blossoms, and I could even hear the quiet, subtle murmur of a fountain somewhere off in the distance. But I was too large to enter by the little door, so I stooped and tried with all my might to squeeze in through it, but in vain. Returning to the table, I soon found that a little bottle had been left behind, which had a label with the words, "Drink me," on it. I hesitated for a moment, remembering all the tales about poison and danger, but this didn't feel like a dangerous place. It felt safe, comforting, like a dream I did not want to wake from. And so I took a sip, then another, and as I did, I felt myself shrinking, getting smaller and smaller, till I was just the right size to fit in. And with that little door to the magical garden beckoned to me, and I did want to see what was inside. Thus excited inside, I hastened toward the door only to realize that I'd left the golden key on the table. Immediately, my heart fell. When I turned back, my disappointment grew greater. Now I was too small to reach it. The table, which had seemed so ordinary, was a tall giant now, with smooth legs, with no way to climb up to it. I tried. Oh, how I tried. I stretched my tiny arms, but the key remained out of reach, glinting through the glass. Tired and frustrated, I let a few tears slip. I would never be able to see the beautiful garden. Come now, Alice, I chided myself, wiping my eyes. There's no use crying over unreachable keys. I needed a solution. My eyes scanned the room, falling to a little glass box beneath the table. Still eager to see what was inside, I crawled up and opened it. A little cake had "Eat Me" written in currants upon it. It was delightful. What could go wrong with a little cake? Well, I'll eat it, I concluded. If it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key. If it makes me smaller, I can slip under the door. Either way, I'd get into that lovely garden. I took a bite, expecting something out of this world. But when I laid my hand on my head, it felt nothing. No change. I was still the same small size. I had grown so used to strange things happening that staying the same almost felt disappointing. But I wasn't one to give up easily. I ate the cake to the end, so that I could somehow enter that garden. While waiting, I couldn't but wonder what wonders were hidden behind that door. Whatever they were, I was ready for this adventure. Within a few seconds, I began to grow taller and bigger, and by now, I hardly fitted into the hall anymore. My key to a fantasy world was now within grasp. I grasped the key and moved gaiety towards the door. Soon, I realized I was too big for the door. The heart panged with disappointment, and before I knew it, tears came down my face, each falling into the growing pool at my feet. My sadness was now as deep as to leave me wondering whether I was still Alice amidst this upside-down world where nothing seemed to make any sense whatsoever. Well, the mere supposition had reduced me to a small lost creature. Lost indeed, I soon began to make out the figure of a little familiar fellow there, the white rabbit, scurrying along in his usual frantic way. A gleam of hope lit my heart. "Oh, Mr. Rabbit," I cried out in a trembling voice, half desperate and half relieved. For sure he would have answers, or at least comfort. But to my horror, the rabbit looked only at me with big, frightened eyes and suddenly took to running wordlessly, leaving behind just a pair of white gloves. I picked them up, more lost and alone than before. In that moment of utter confusion, I sought assurance that indeed I was still Alice. I began to sing a nursery rhyme, which I had memorized since childhood. But the words, they tumbled out of my mouth all wrong, as if the thread of memory itself had unraveled into a mass of gibberish. I tried once more, but there was no use. A nothing felt right. It was as though the world had taken my memories and spun them into something quite unfamiliar, unrecognized. I felt far more a stranger in my skin than I ever had. Uncaring, in my confusion, I slipped one of the rabbit's gloves onto my hand, shocked to find that it fitted my hand like a second skin perfectly, but too well. I looked down and was astounded to see that I was shrinking again. What should have been much too small now felt quite right. I had no time to lose. Availing myself of this new opening, I scurried for the garden door. Turning, I came full in the view of that pool of tears I had wept at so bitterness just a few moments before. That which was a puddle before now turned into a sea of water, and there was no avoiding it. I had little choice but to wade in the water and swim. The cool liquid churned around me, and I kicked, freeing myself from the immediate tangle of plants. As I paddled, I realized I wasn't the only thing swimming in the water. Suddenly, there were all kinds of things swimming alongside me: a mouse, a duck, even a dodo. The mouse swam nearest to me, so I decided to strike up a conversation, hoping it might distract me from the strangeness of it all. "Hello," I said in a soft voice. "My name is Alice. Please, can you tell me how I could leave this sea of tears?" The mouse turned to me with his shiny eyes and squeaked very lightly. "Oh, I think we only need to keep going. Sometimes the exit appears when we least expect it." I nodded, and was rather comforted by the mouse's cool demeanor. Then, with a new sense of hope, I swam on, following the mouse and the others, and slowly but surely, I could feel a sense of direction in this curious world where it seemed that logic had taken a holiday. "Hello, mouse," I began in as jolly a voice as I could manage, my tone still quavering a bit. "This is a very strange affair we are both involved in, don't you think?" But before I knew it, I was relating to him all about Dinah, my cat. I hadn't meant to hurt his feelings, and I didn't mean anything by it, but the mouse's ears perked when I mentioned Dinah loved to hunt mice. The more I talked, the more stirred up the mouse got, and at last I realized with a violent start that I had made a perfectly horrible blunder. After listening, the mouse said, "Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is I hate cats and dogs." When, at last, we dragged ourselves, shivering and dripping, onto the dry land, the mouse thoughtfully attempted to dry us by telling us, "The driest thing I know is a long and blasted tale of the Norman conquest." I, geopolitical, tried to listen, but it was all so painfully dull that it put us more in a soak than ever. The rest of the beasts seemed to agree, so we all huddled in closer, just as wet and cold as before. Just at this moment, just when I was thinking that this could be our permanent state, an idea sprang into the dodo's head. He offered a caucus race, no rules, no course, just run in every direction you can as fast as you go. It was complete madness, utterly illogical, and just the mere motion warmed us and dried us. In a trice, we were all laughing at the absurdity of it, taking no more notice of our recent tribulations. When we finally stopped, panting and smiling, another question arose. Who had won? The dodo, ever sanguine diplomat, announced that we had all won, and prizes must be given. I reached into my pocket, hoping to find something to give, and to my relief found some old candy stashed away. I handed them out, one for each creature, but when I reached in once more, realized, with a pang, that I had nothing left for myself. The more the animals insisted I should have a prize, and the dodo said, "Do you have anything else in your pocket?" I dug around and found one thimble. The dodo took it with great ceremony, made a little speech, and then handed it back to me as if it were the most precious thing in the world. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and took the thimble, looking as serious as I could, feeling a curious mixture of absurdity and gratitude, and maybe a bit of comfort. It wasn't the garden I had wished to enter, but somehow, just then, with these strange new companions around me, I wasn't quite so lost. And yet, even now, I still didn't know what was going to happen next. But I did know one thing for sure. That strange, wonderful journey was far from over. The next thing was to eat the comfits. This caused some noise and confusion, as the large birds complained that they could not taste theirs, and the small ones choked and had to be patted on the back. However, it was over at last, and we all sat down again in a ring and begged the mouse to tell them something more. "You promised to tell me your history, you know," I said, "and why it is you hate cats and dogs," I added in a whisper, half afraid that it would be offended again. "My long and sad tale," said the mouse, turning to me and sighing. As the mouse started telling its story once more, I felt myself drift even deeper into the world where the edges of reality were poetically softened. The air had a dreamy quality to it, like light fog clung to the glade, muting all sounds and making them more fragile. The story it wove was soft, almost lyrical in cadence, and with every word I felt a stroke that rocked me into quieter space. "Once upon a time," the mouse began in a low, soothing voice, "there was a grand kingdom, far beyond the ordinary view of any map. Nestled between rolling hills and sparkling rivers, the very leaves whispered secrets, and the stars danced in the velvet night sky." The description painted was so colorful that I could almost envision the shimmering rivers and feel the cool, dewy grass beneath my feet. It was as if the mouse was painting a picture with words. Each stroke added to a tapestry of wonder. "In this kingdom," the mouse continued, "there lived a princess, not like any other princess you have heard of. She had hair of spun gold and eyes as clear as the morning dew. Her heart was gentle, and she loved the creatures of the land, from the tiniest firefly to the grandest stag." I could all but see her now, wandering through some sun-dappled meadow, her laughter mingling with the songs of birds. The image was bright enough that I felt a peaceful smile touch my lips. Yet, the mouse's voice took on a softer, wistful tone. The princess had a sorrow that veiled her days. She had lost something precious to her, something which once gave her immense joy. It was a locket, simple and fragile, but within it lay a secret binding her to the land's magic. My ears perked up. I leaned in closer, entranced by the mouse's tale. The glade around me seemed to pulse with the mouse's words, each sentence a soft ripple on a sea of calm. "The locket," said the mouse, "held within it the whispers of the wind and the songs of the stars. And as long as it was missing, the kingdom's magic began to break, and the heart of the princess grew lead-heavy with care. She sought high and low, through enchanted forests, over moonlit lakes, never taking any rest. But nowhere could the locket be found. My heart hurt a little for the princess too, but the mouse's tail had wrapped itself around me like a soft, warm blanket, serenely soothing my thoughts and concerns. Then one day," the mouse said in a brightened tone, "as the princess strolled along a quiet path by a silver stream, she found this little curious creature. This was a little rabbit with fur as soft as the clouds and eyes that flashed with mischief. This rabbit had found the locket, and when the princess saw it, her heart leaped with joy." I could almost see the whole scene right before my eyes. The princess's eyes light up, the little rabbit hop in delight, the locket glittering in the sun. The feeling of joy and relief was palpably soft, a soul-soothing balm. The mouse continued, The rabbit then danced up to the princess merrily, and returned the locket to her. From then on, the spell of the kingdom was broken. The grateful and joyful princess appointed the rabbit as her royal companion, spreading peace and happiness to the land. As soon as the mouse's tale was concluded, my soul was bathed in the peaceful feeling of sweet moments repairing even the deepest lacerations. The beasts about us were far more at ease now and commenced to murmur in soft agreement. I looked sideways at the mouse, whose eyes shone with a contented glow, and knew well that this tale had touched not just my heart but theirs too. "Thank you," I said softly. "That was the most comforting story I've ever heard." The mouse smiled, a tiny, gratified curl of the whiskers, and the creatures about me began to stir, their movements soft and peaceful. The sun was commencing its setting, and a warm, golden light was cast over the glade, the whole world bathed in the soft, soothing glow of it. As I sat down again, leaning against the old tree, the world outside the glade receded into distance and insignificance, and all that was left was this green sanctuary and the reassurance of companionship from the creatures that were around me. The mouse's tail had spun a cocoon of peace, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into a deep, refreshing sleep, surrounded by the warmth of the glade and the soft murmurs of a fantastic world wherein everything was right and beautiful. It was the white rabbit, shuffling along slowly once more and peering anxiously about it as it went, as if it had lost something. Directly after the rabbit noticed me, he called out to me in an angry tone, "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick, now." I heard this, and I was so much frightened that I ran off at once in the direction it pointed to. Having lost the gloves, I decided to search for them. In searching for the gloves, I chanced to observe a small house with the name W. Rabbit, and steps in. Curious again, I took a sip from still another bottle. The house became even too small. The arm running out of the window, one leg stretched up the chimney. I could not get about without knocking something over. The creaking grew louder and louder. I seemed to be unable to get free, and the possibility of being really tightened in alarmed me. As I was struggling with my large body, I heard footsteps. Perhaps they were the rabbit's. He determines that he will send Bill the lizard through the chimney to get his gloves. I heard Bill scrambling above me, and with a swift kick, sent the lizard flying the other way like a rocket. Now, outside, I hear the rabbit's familiar voice, shrill and impatient. He says, "We must burn the house down." His voice trembling with determination, Quat exclaimed quickly, "If you do, I'll set Dinah, my cat, at you." The rabbit, however, wasn't intimidated by my threat. I could hear him rustling about outside, clearly trying to puzzle it out. What if he actually did set the house on fire? I was too big to get out, I thought. As soon as the mouse's tale was concluded, my soul was bathed in the peaceful feeling of sweet moments repairing even the deepest lacerations. The beasts about us were hot more at ease now and commenced to murmur in soft agreement. I looked sideways at the mouse, whose eyes shone with a contented glow, and knew well that this tale had touched not just my heart, but theirs too. "Thank you," I said softly. "That was the most comforting story I've ever heard." The mouse smiled, a tiny, gratified curl of the whiskers, and the creatures about me began to stir, their movements soft and peaceful. The sun was commencing its setting, and a warm, golden light was cast over the glade, the whole world bathed in the soft, soothing glow of it. As I sat down again, leaning against the old tree, the world outside the glade receded into distance and insignificance, and all that was left was this green sanctuary and the reassurance of companionship from the creatures that were around me. The mouse's tail had spun a cocoon of peace, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into a deep, refreshing sleep, surrounded by the warmth of the glade and the soft murmurs of a fantastic world wherein everything was right and beautiful. It was the white rabbit, shuffling along slowly once more and peering anxiously about it as it went, as if it had lost something. Directly after the rabbit noticed me, he called out to me in an angry tone, "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick, now." I heard this, and I was so much frightened that I ran off at once in the direction it pointed to. Having lost the gloves, I decided to search for them. In searching for the gloves, I chanced to observe a small house with the name W. Rabbit, and steps in. Curious again, I took a sip from still another bottle. The house became even too small, the arm running out of the window, one leg stretched up the chimney. I could not get about without knocking something over. The creaking grew louder and louder. I seemed to be unable to get free, and the possibility of being really tightened in alarmed me. As I was struggling with my large body, I heard footsteps. Perhaps they were the rabbit's. He determines that he will send Bill the lizard through the chimney to get his gloves. I heard Bill scrambling above me, and with a swift kick, sent the lizard flying the other way like a rocket. Now, outside, I hear the rabbit's familiar voice, shrill and impatient. He says, "We must burn the house down." His voice trembling with determination, Quat exclaimed quickly, "If you do, I'll set Dinah, my cat, at you." The rabbit, however, wasn't intimidated by my threat. I could hear him rustling about outside, clearly trying to puzzle it out. What if he actually did set the house on fire? I was too big to get out, I thought. Then, the small and soft things began pelting against my arm-small pebbles to begin with, or so I thought. But when they bounded off me and fell inside, I realized they were not pebbles but little cakes, glistening invitingly, almost as if they were bidding me to taste them. I carefully plucked one up between my fingers. One tiny, dainty nibble, and I felt the world start to shift around me. The house that had seemed so tiny now expanded as I shrank down to my normal size. My arm slipped back through the window, my leg slid out of the chimney. Free! I burst open the front door, now flinging myself out into the open air. The rabbit, now standing just outside, looked upward in a gesture of surprise and frustration. "There, you see?" I exclaimed breathlessly. "There's no need to burn anything down after all." The rabbit snorted, unimpressed by my reasoning. "You still lost my gloves," he groused, nose twitching in annoyance. But before he had time to say anything else, I pivoted and started running, not waiting for him to change his mind about the fire. These trees seemed to lean in, shutting out a world not mine, their soft susurrus soothing my racing thoughts. I felt that the forest was rocking me, its gentle breeze a lullaby of reassurance. The voice of the rabbit grew indistinct, then was erased altogether by the peaceful hum of woodland creatures. As I ran, I looked all round the flowers and the blades of grass, but I did not see anything that looked like the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. I saw a large mushroom growing near me, about the same height as myself. I stretched myself up on tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and my eyes immediately met those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top with its arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah and taking not the smallest notice of me or of anything else. "Who are you?" asked the caterpillar. I timidly replied, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." "I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir," said I, "because I'm not myself, you see." "Why?" asked the caterpillar, another difficult question. And as I couldn't think of any good reason, and as the caterpillar seemed to be in a very unpleasant state of mind, I turned away. "Come back," the caterpillar called after me. "I've something important to say." This sounded promising, certainly. I turned and went back again. The caterpillar said something strange about the mushroom. He said, while crawling down off the mushroom, "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter." One side of what? The other side of what? I wondered. "Of the mushroom," said the caterpillar, just as though I had asked it aloud, and in another moment it was out of sight. Puzzled as to which are the sides of a round mushroom, I broke it in two pieces as far apart as I can. I shrank at first, but before I could disappear, I took a bite from the other piece and grew. Unfortunately, not my whole body has grown, but only my neck, leading a pigeon to mistake me for a serpent. Then I ate each different piece of the mushroom and became a little taller and a little shorter until I arrived at my original height. I then took a walk through the woods until I came to the house of the Duchess. I observed a fish-faced footman give a frog-faced footman an invitation from the Queen of Hearts to play croquet. The shrill voice of the Queen still rang in my ears as I was left to myself once more in that strange garden. The fluttering of my heart was like the wings of an imprisoned bird, yet to recover from the absurdity of the croquet game, flamingos for mallets, hedgehogs for balls, everything so appallingly wrong and yet enchantingly incorrect all at once. But now the air was tight with a purposed menace, and I knew I had to tread with care. A great rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. I thought this a very curious thing, and I went nearer to watch them, and just as I came up to them I heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five, don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. 7 jogged on my elbow. They all shaped in a curious manner, oblong and flat with their hands and feet at the corners. I soon came to the conclusion that they were living cards. "Would you tell me," I said a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find it out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know." Suddenly there was a sound of many footsteps, and I looked round. Full of curiosity to see the Queen first came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked two and two, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Next came the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And last of all this grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Her voice boomed across the air, and the nape of my neck prickled from some weird sensation. There was something fascinating, yet terrifying about her. Commanding attention like an oncoming storm, she was only a card after all, I told myself as I joined the strange procession, my head low. Beside me, the white rabbit quivered his ears in nervousness and whispered hastily something of the Duchess's fate. My curiosity bubbled, so soft, like the hum of a stream. But before I had time to ask more, another command was barked out from the Queen. Sudden it was, at which my heart leaped slightly, but I smiled to myself. This was Wonderland after all. Nothing stayed peaceful for long. And what a game it was as the croquet game began. I reached for the flamingo, and its long neck arced over like a question mark, its head looking back at me. "Oh, you poor thing," I cooed, stroking its downy plumage. The flamingo softly squawked in response, as if resigned to its odd purposes. The hedgehog, curled up tightly at my feet, stirred slightly as I lined up. I lightly tapped the head of the flamingo on the ground, trying not to spook it too much, and away went the hedgehog in a totally uncalled-for manner, jolting over ridges and furrows of the badly groomed croquet field. I couldn't help but snort loudly, all to myself over the absurdity of it all. "Off with their heads!" The Queen shrieked at this, and I fairly jumped out of my skin. By this time I had looked about me enough to know that no one was doing anything wrong, at least nothing palpable, yet all of them were guilty, or at any rate thought themselves so. The game continued, stumbling players falling over each other, soldiers contorting themselves into arches, the Queen yelling orders for every mismove. I did my best to follow, but it wasn't easy not to get whirled about in the madness, squawking flamingos, grunting hedgehogs, and everywhere cards running about in utter confusion. "Do you always play croquet like this?" I asked the rabbit, who was still twitching nervously beside me. "Always," he whispered, his eyes darting from side to side. "But it's best not to question things here, Alice. The Queen is easily displeased." I nodded, tightening my grip on my flamingo a little. It was all just so dumb, but somehow I felt a strange calm in the middle of all the chaos. The madness was oddly comforting in its own way, like a dream that made no sense, but somehow felt safe. As I got ready for my second turn, there was the Cheshire Cat again, his grin first visible in the distance, hanging in the air just over the tops of the hedges. I smiled softly to myself. Nothing really could be scary when things were so fanciful out in the air. "Play on, Alice," that grin seemed to say, and I did, letting myself go to the weird rhythm of Wonderland. All the while, searching for some means of escape, I suddenly heard the soft, almost indistinguishable humming of a familiar purring. It was comforting, in a manner of speaking, like a lullaby. I looked up, and there it was. First, The Cheshire Cat's grin materialized in the air. Then its gleaming eyes showed, followed by the rest of the head. "Well, this is an interesting predicament, isn't it?" The cat purred smooth as silk, the tone floating in air around me. I couldn't help but feel a tiny bit relieved. At least with the Cheshire Cat, there was always some sense of logic, as twisted as it may be. "Why does everything here have to be so difficult?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, not wanting to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. The cat's grin spread, a gleaming crescent in the dappled sunlight. "If it were easy, my dear, it wouldn't be Wonderland," it replied, as if that explained it all. Just as I was going to ask another question, the head of the cat began to disappear, starting with the ears and working its way down so that nothing remained except that perpetual, mischievous grin. "Good luck," it said, and then even the grin disappeared, leaving me only with the rustling leaves and the far-off murmur of the Queen's soldiers. As the king and the executioner turned and ran wildly up the hill, looking frantically and utterly bewildered, I couldn't suppress a small snicker. It was so very much out of the ordinary to see everybody racing after a disappearing smile as if that were the most natural thing in the world. Yet here, I was beginning to realize, normal was the rarest of things. I tucked the flamingo in a little tighter under my arm, its soft feathers tickling my skin. It let out a small squawk, its neck wriggling as if in protest of its role as a mallet. "Shh, shh," I whispered to it soothingly, hope it would behave just a little while longer. The garden around me, a blur of motion, soldiers doubling themselves into arches, hedgehogs rolling and unrolling, the voice of the Queen carrying on the breeze like the low rumble of some far-off storm. This game had lost all sense to me now, not that it ever truly did. I wandered on slowly, unhurriedly in the manner of a dream. The Cheshire Cat's grin lingered on in my mind, though long gone from view now. Its cryptic smile had seemed to know more than it let on, and I wondered if I would see it again any time soon. Just then the Duchess appeared, accompanied by 2 guards. She was no less strange than on the occasion of my previous audience with her. Her aquiline face softened to some degree now by a curious air of resignation. "So it is you," she said, peering down at me with her small, beady eyes. "Yes, it's me," I said, attempting to match her deadpan delivery. She looked from the Queen, who was still yelling at the players, to me. "These games, they're nonsense, aren't they?" She sighed, her tone the most soft and very similar in quality to indicate she too was tired of the madness. "They are," I agreed, wearied by it all. "Nothing here makes sense." The Duchess smiled small, knowing. "That's the way of Wonderland, my dear," she said, the cadence near to a lullaby. "Nothing ever does." And with that, she whirled around and was engulfed by the crowd as I stood there with my restless flamingo, watching the madness unfold. The Queen's voice was still loud. It only now seemed to fade away into the distance, a hum, as a weird calm began to settle over me. I looked up to the sky, watching the clouds lazily drift across above, and in that moment, time stood still. I was curious as to where this strange path I'd found myself on would go from there, but somehow it didn't seem to matter. Here, in this curious world, the flow of time was different, and all I needed to do was follow it step by step, breath by breath. I blinked, and the world of Wonderland vanished around me, slowly, like mist when the morning sun reaches it. The Queen's croquet ground, the soldiers, the Cheshire Cat's grin. Everything began to blur and get soft around the edges so that it felt more like a memory and less than reality. Then I heard the voice, a very familiar one, though faint. "Alice, Alice, wake up." My eyes flickered open, and there was my sister, smiling down at me with that soft, knowing look. I lay on soft grass beneath the shade of a great tree. The dappled sunlight warmed my face. The air felt fresh, and I could hear the quiet rustling of leaves above, like some soft whisper. For a moment, I just lay there, still wrapped in the dream I'd just left. The adventures with the White Rabbit, the Mad Hatter's tea party, the strange game of croquet, it all felt so real, like I could still reach out and touch it. I smiled to myself. The memory still danced around me like a pleasant breeze. "Were you dreaming again?" my sister asked in a soft tone, like the lullaby melody, a sound very familiar. I sat up slowly, feeling the cool grass beneath my hands, and nodded, still not quite ready to let go of the dream entirely. "I was," I whispered, "and it was the strangest dream." My voice fell away as I stared around the garden at which I sat. It was just as it had been, quiet, peaceful, and completely plain. Still, something of wonder lingered in the atmosphere. Some vestige Wonderland had bequeathed it on its passing, a radiance which hovered out of sight. My sister smiled, plucking a stray leaf from my hair. "You have the most uncanny vivid dreams," she said, her voice light, as if she knew in those dreams I wandered far from the ordinary. I looked out across the meadow, the soft hum of insects filling the air, and let out a long, contented breath. "I do," I replied, "but this one was different." She cocked her head to one side, curious but patient, as I related disjointed parts of the adventure. The talking animals, the disappearing cat, the nonsensical games. All sounded even more peculiar as I spoke the words aloud, yet somehow it was all the more wonder-filled because it was shared. As I finished, we sat in a comfortable silence, soft, with the world's sounds dimly screaming around us like a lullaby. I leaned back against the tree and closed my eyes for just a moment. A thought materialized in that quiet. Would I ever find my way back to Wonderland? Or was this just some wistful dream of mine, one short-lived and fanciful flight into a world where anything could happen? Either way, I knew how that feeling remained, that wonder, that magic in the air. And in the drifting between waking and sleeping, I knew that it would remain with me, always, tucked somewhere in my mind like a secret, waiting for tonight or some other night. And with that comforting thought, I smiled to myself, letting the soft breeze carry me gently back into the waking world.